The door slammed so hard the portraits trembled. Carole Middleton didn't pause to remove her coat. She strode straight across the marble, heels cracking like gunfire against the floor. Two startled footmen stepped aside as she pushed through into the drawing room, the faint scent of roses trailing behind her like a warning. Camilla was there, mid-sip of tea, the thistle brooch flashing in the afternoon light. The cup froze halfway to her lips. "What exactly," Carole said, voice low but razor-edged, "did you say to my granddaughter?" The silence that followed felt like the second before glass shatters, thin, perfect, and ready to cut. "If you think palace scandals are polite affairs, think again." This one moved in the shadows between official smiles and private fury, where even the most powerful women can lose control when it comes to blood. Tonight, Carole wasn't a royal in-law. She was a grandmother on the warpath. The public saw nothing unusual, smiling crowds, the king's entourage gliding as planned. But the real story began in a back corridor of Marlborough House, where a guard overheard a clipped, dismissive tone no child should hear. Charlotte's small, careful, "Yes, Your Majesty," was followed by retreating footsteps. He never saw her face, the tightened jaw, the thumb pressed into her sleeve seam, but the moment traveled quickly, guard to aide to staff, staff to someone with Carole Middleton's number. In Bucklebury, Carole answered the call. It was unkind. And it wasn't the first time, the voice said. She hung up slowly, her mind already tracing the route to the woman at the center of it. 2 days later, she arrived in London without speeches or letters, only a small box in her handbag, holding a pale blue ribbon, frayed at one end. It had been Charlotte's favorite last summer. Now, it had purpose. Clarence's house gleamed, the air thick with politeness. Camilla was already in the drawing room, fingers curled on the armrest. "Carole," she said. "Your Majesty," Carole replied, placing her bag at her feet. The silence between them was tactical. Carole spoke of childhood, resilience, the lessons we pass on. Camilla listened, eyes narrowing when Charlotte's name appeared. Then Carole set the ribbon on the table, truce or challenge. For Carole, it was a symbol of gentleness, of the threads holding a child's confidence. For Camilla, sentiment was weakness. She touched it briefly, then withdrew. Outside, buses rumbled and cameras clicked, the public unaware that inside, two women measured each other's resolve. Carole breathed in, remembering Charlotte's first school drop-off, polished shoes, that same ribbon, the brave release of her hand. Now it lay between them, a fragment of an ordinary morning turned into a quiet declaration of war. "You misunderstand the pressures," Camilla said finally, voice flat as hammered silver. She did not look at the ribbon. She did not have to. Carole's response was not a counterstrike but a refusal to step back. "Children feel pressure differently," she said, and it was not an accusation, it was a statement about gravity, about the way weight sits small and heavy on narrow shoulders. They also remember. It wasn't a fight, fighting would have been easier. It was a negotiation with the weather. Afterwards the footman returned as if on the hour, not before, not late. The door opened, and the world, with its newspapers and appointments and engagements, resumed. The two women stood. Camilla went first, not out of courtesy but geography, her role was closer to the exit. Carole gathered the ribbon into the small box, closed the lid, and slipped it back into her bag. Neither of them offered the fiction of another meeting. In Kensington later that afternoon, Catherine's study was a rehearsal of calm. A fountain pen lay exactly parallel to the edge of a blotter. A small ceramic horse Charlotte had painted 2 birthdays ago sat slightly askew, stubbornly imperfect in a world that ironed imperfections for a living. Carole did not tell her daughter everything. She offered the gist, the outline, the temperature. Catherine listened without interruption and at the end said, in that measured tone that betrayed itself only by offering precision where anyone else might have reached for grace, "I'll handle what must be handled from here." William arrived late, apology written in his posture. He didn't ask what was said, years under chandeliers had taught him that the current mattered more than the words. "I'll talk to my father," he promised, meaning he'd choose his moment, pick the right room, and go alone. The week moved on. At a charity garden party, Camilla wore her thistle brooch, smiling for cameras that caught only the polish, not the frost. Out of frame, Charlotte's gaze drifted anywhere but toward her. The first whispers reached the press through casual routine. A caterer mentioned an icy moment to a friend, then another source spoke of someone having snapped. A quiet news day made space for the story. The palace comms office logged a politely phrased parental complaint about tone and issued a bland, 7-outlet statement that said everything and nothing. Meanwhile, Carole kept Charlotte's ribbon in her handbag like an anchor, touching it in taxis, in shop aisles, at the sink. This was not a battle of sharp blows but one of endurance. When the Natural History Museum event came, Carole attended, navy dress, quiet pearls, to be seen by exactly the right eyes. Charlotte, drawn to a fossil spiral, called it a ribbon to herself. Camilla looked across the room. Carole met her gaze without blinking. In a side gallery smelling of stone and polish, Camilla declared, "This family is steel. We do not bend for weather." "Steel rusts without oil," Carole replied. "Children are the oil." The exchange left no winners but rippled outward. Columns debated royal discipline, photographs were parsed for meaning. One candid of Charlotte without her ribbon became a symbol. In a private room, William told the king, "Something burns somewhere else, and we smell it here." The king rubbed his forehead. "It's all fumes," he said. But both knew the air was already thick. "It's not fumes," William answered, not looking to wound but to clarify. "It's a match struck near tinder." He meant it figuratively, but the king understood literally too. He had spent his life watching small sparks undone by large winds, and, sometimes, the other way around. "What is it you want?" the king asked finally, an honest question dressed in official fabric. "I want my daughter to never think kindness is a weakness," William said, and while he kept his face in check, the sentence trembled under its own load. "I want her grandmother to not have to carry a ribbon around like armor." The king set his pen down. He picked it up again. He was deciding whether to sign something no one would see, a permission, a warning, a letter that would live in a drawer as a future relic. "I'll speak to her," he said, which meant he would choose a day when morning light softened the edges of everything and say her name before anything else. Across the city, Catherine took the ribbon from her mother. She turned it in her fingers and pressed it flat against the edge of the blotter where her pen had been lined up. "She's tougher than we give her credit for," she said, and she meant Charlotte and herself and perhaps the whole lineage of women who had learned to smile while a storm grew underneath. But toughness isn't the point. That night, Carole lay awake. Outside the window, the hedges of Bucklebury were black cutouts against a lighter black. She tried to replay the day without sound, as if removing dialogue would strip the heat from the images. It did not. In its place she heard footsteps, her own, measured and slow, Charlotte's, quick, a half-run that never tipped into unruliness, Camilla's, steady and unhurried, the cadence of someone who had learned that rooms wait for her body to arrive before anyone else moves. She got up, went to the kitchen, and poured water into a glass with deliberate care. On the table, she spread out the objects of this battle, ribbon, phone, an old photograph of Charlotte holding a wooden spoon like a conductor's baton. She added, impulsively, a small seashell from the Natural History Museum gift shop. She had bought it quietly, paying in cash, as if the act were illicit. It was not a souvenir. It was a reminder that spirals turn inward as well as outward. In the morning, the tabloids led with a composite headline that managed to accuse everyone of everything without naming anyone at all. The palace statement did its work of wetting the flames without admitting there was a fire. People picked sides in the way people choose teams at a village fair. The only person who did not know about any of it, in the perfect, temporary way of childhood, was the child at the center, who insisted on bringing a small paper bag of bread to the ducks and who protested when the bread went soggy in her hand. It's still bread, she argued, and by then the soggy bread had become a symbol for anyone who needed it to be one. At a state lunch, wineglasses chimed, cutlery gleamed, and Camilla's thistle brooch caught the light. She smiled just a little too much, something the cameras missed but those inside noticed. A hand-lettered place card sat before her, perfectly correct in name and title, offering neither peace nor provocation. She laughed on cue at a sea storm story, then later, alone, unpinned the brooch, leaving a small crescent on her skin. The next clash came in a Highgrove greenhouse, no witnesses but the leaves and a bee drifting between blossoms. Carole, uninvited, arrived anyway. "You understand, children," she told Camilla, "but forget what it costs them to be brave on command." Camilla's reply was cool: "We were required to be brave too." Carole didn't flinch. "No one asked you to be kind to the person who commanded it." They never used the word bullying, but the air between them carried its shape. Nothing changed, and yet everything had. The public turned it into a parenting debate, experts dissected body language while Camilla made high-profile charity visits. In private, Carole received a letter from a retired nanny: "You are not wrong to hold a ribbon like a sword. Just remember to lay it down like a blanket when the room finally warms." She placed it in the box with the ribbon. At a school play, Charlotte headed straight for Carole but paused to glance at Camilla, a silent, instinctive check: "You safe?" Camilla's nod was small but clear. The image went viral, captioned into every meaning imaginable, though in truth it showed only a child making a real-time risk assessment. The third and final confrontation came without Carole. Catherine faced Camilla in a room thick with history. "I'm asking you to be softer with my child," she said, precise and unshaken. "Not gentler in public. Softer in private." Camilla set her hands on the arms of the chair in a way that suggested both restraint and a wish to rise. "Softness is not the lesson," she answered, and her voice did not fail her. "Endurance is." "Endurance without tenderness is just a longer version of hurt," Catherine said, and then she did something that palace women rarely do in rooms with tapestries. She allowed silence to accumulate and did not move to sweep it away. In the long minute that followed, the room filled with a sound like dust settling on certainty. Camilla looked out the window at a lawn that could take a squadron a day to mow. When she looked back, she did not smile. "I will try," she said, and in that verb there was a new architecture. The story didn't end. Stories like this don't. They change key. In public, the conversation turned to other dramas. The world had never been short of them. Camilla leaned harder into patronages that involved listening rather than speaking. She surprised a charity director by staying an extra 20 minutes to read with a child who read the way some people run, breathless, urgent, falling forward. William took to adjusting his schedule to move through corridors where Charlotte might be on her way from French to science. He developed, suddenly and with an earnestness he found embarrassing, an interest in spiral fossils. "They remind me of breathing," he told a friend, who smiled without fully understanding. Carole returned to Buckleberry with a bag of biscuits she hadn't intended to buy. She took the ribbon out of the box exactly 3 times in a week and then stopped. She caught herself one day moving toward the box and turned instead to the garden. She cut roses and then, oddly, a sprig of rosemary, crushing it between finger and thumb to let its sharp scent rise. She set the herbs in a glass of water on the kitchen table and found that their smell refocused the air. The box remained in the drawer. Not forgotten. Just no longer required as a talisman. In the press office, a draft statement lived for a while on a shared drive. It was perfect and doomed: families are complicated. Ours is no exception. It was never approved because truth is dangerous when it's that bare. Instead, a photograph went out, a grandmother's hand, not labeled, holding a child's wrist with an absence of grip that is its own kind of safety. People wrote poems about it. People wrote complaints. The image did the quiet work images do when you let them. One afternoon, weeks later, a teacup in Clarence's house met its saucer with that precise crystalline sound again. The china did not shiver. Or rather, if it did, it was the slightest tremor, one that acknowledged memory without repeating it. The house was not a furnace of politeness that day. It was simply a house where people lived and had to drink tea because talking is thirsty work. Camilla sat alone for a moment, the thistle brooch pinned at a different angle, its edge no longer pointing like a weapon but simply resting. On the side table, an envelope lay open. Inside it, a card with a child's drawing, not extraordinary, mostly spirals and a word that could be shall or shall. She would not admit to herself that the drawing warmed a corner of the room. She did not have to. Charlotte, in another house, paused on the way to piano to ready a ribbon that may or may not have been the ribbon. This one was cleaner, brighter, less frayed. Her fingers fumbled the knot once, then got it right on the second try. She looked at herself in the mirror quickly, not vanity, inventory, and then, satisfied, went to the room with the metronome she loved and hated. The metronome's tick set a heartbeat that belonged to no person and therefore felt fair. At a corner table in a cafe where no one expected to see her, Carole stirred tea until the sugar disappeared and then kept stirring because the motion mattered more than the result. In her bag lay the box, not as a weapon now but as a relic. She took it out and placed it on the table as if to prove to herself that objects can lose their voltage by exposure. She opened it. The ribbon lay coiled like a small sea creature asleep. She touched it with 2 fingers, then smiled at her own superstition and closed the lid. She thought of all the things that had not been said, all the syllables swallowed to protect a child from knowing too soon the words adults sharpen in secret. She breathed out, long and steady. In the palace corridors, staff learned a new choreography so subtle it would never be documented. Doors opened a fraction faster when small feet approached. Voices dropped half a note lower when giving correction. A set of marble steps gained a rug runner that someone had been requesting for years but had always been told was an unnecessary expense. The rug absorbed the sound of running like a generous aunt. The last moment, the one that would sit in the chest for a long time after the music stopped, arrived without announcement. In the garden at Bucklebury, evening moved in on soft soles. Carole and Charlotte picked late raspberries that hid under leaves like secrets that weren't mine to tell. Charlotte lifted a berry to the light, its small cells glowing like a handheld constellation. "Do you think plants talk to each other?" she asked, not as a child but as a scientist still wearing childhood's shoes. "I think they listen," Carole said. "And I think they warn each other when a storm is coming." Charlotte considered that, then gave one small, decisive nod, as if the explanation fit into the shape of the world she was making. She reached into her cardigan pocket, brought out a piece of string, not a ribbon, just a rough cotton string, and tied it around the cane that held the raspberry bush upright. It was not symbolic to her. It was practical. The plant leaned, she supported it. But as she walked ahead, leaving the string behind in the dim, it caught a sliver of last light and hummed. Carole felt a space open in her chest, the exact size of relief. Somewhere else, in a different house with better curtains, Camilla stood at a window watching a square of lawn-learn night. She thought of a greenhouse's heat and a tomato vine's resin on her fingers. She thought of a sentence she had said and another she had not. She reached for the brooch at her shoulder and, without looking, straightened it by a fraction. Not armor. Placement. In the glass, her reflection didn't look like a queen. It looked like a woman counting her breath to 4 and letting it out to 8. No headline captured this part. Headlines rarely capture the soft ending, the after of a storm when leaves are darker and roads are cleaner and everyone pretends not to sniff the air. In the child's room, the metronome stood silent. On the desk, a small shell from a museum gift shop sat beside a pencil stub. The shell spiral made its old argument, that what wins inward might also wind out. The pencil promised that marks can be erased and drawn again and still count. When the night finally settled over gardens and Greyston and glass, it did so without ceremony. A ribbon slept in a box in a kitchen drawer. A brooch rested on velvet. A child dreamed of pirates too polite to steal. And in the quiet between those objects, the adults rehearsed a new, difficult kindness, not the kind that performs well, but the kind that looks like 2 women in separate rooms making separate decisions to use softer words the next time the air crackled. The scandal did not disappear. It thinned, stretched, and became one thread among many. The thread held. The house held. A grandmother finished her tea, set the cup down carefully, and let the room be still long enough to hear the last small sound of the spoon coming to rest. Like and subscribe the channel if you liked this story.